Here is Sailor Studio 143. Now, the chromatography of this says true blue, and the swatch shows a darker blue than the writing sample does. So, as a blue, it is softer and lighter than we really expected. This is a noticeable tone shift as paper changes, though it always keeps the soft blue tone. It is a good shade on every paper. This is a good, consistent performer, something that you would really expect from Sailor. Now, standard 20-pound exceptions here on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it stays a solid performer with no bleeding, feathering, and no real spread. The soft mid-tone of this blue makes it exceptionally usable with so many secondary tones and isn't overpowering on the paper. And like so many Sailor inks I would be happy to have a bottle of it. Though I don't know that this is going to be a run to use it all the time, but I'd be very happy every time that I did ink it up.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M800. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we see that it is that soft blue with some darker spots. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade generally fairly well. It makes a statement out of your writing. Look at statement on the second line. Light S, dark T, both dark and light A, slightly darker TE, the MEN lighten up a little bit with a very dark T at the end. Taking a look at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Studio 130. Here is Sailor Florida. Here is Sailor Studio 930. Here is Sailor Kobe number 21.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, though we do occasionally get some words that are entirely one tone, like who's on the first line. Not who's on first, just who's the word on the first line. I think this is, again, very usable because it is, while a light blue, not too light, not too soft. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, outstanding.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now, the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the tone here, we see that it is a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It also starts to look a bit more turquoise than it does on the Clairfontaine. Now, this is a result of this being toned paper. The tone of the paper is affecting the tone of the ink, meaning the ink is more translucent than it is opaque. Otherwise, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade, but not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. You can't expect both to do as well, but shading is there when you look at both on the second line, where the BO is lighter than the TH at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems writing back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see that what we get is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. However, it does not stand out especially well from the quad rule. It really sort of blends with it at the same time. And to make that even harder to deal with is you can see that the line cuts the ink. It causes it at times to sort of split. The ink can't penetrate as the same space as the quad rule, which really is disturbing to me to see. You see it very well happening right here. So this is not something that I would use this ink with quad rule paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more blue inks that are out there.
Here is Diatramentis Madame de Pompadour Dark Blue. Here is Diamine Sapphire Blue. Here is Papier Plume Peacock. Here is Pilot Namiki Blue.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see the tone on the page is lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Really very baby blue in tone. No feather, no spread. Yes, it still shades, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It's just in occasional letters, not all the time. Like you see, not. The no has no is a light tone. The T is darker. It's true there is some shading, but if you look at true, where the T, R, and E are a nice mid-tone, the U is a bit lighter. Not huge in the shading on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Electric Pink.
Here is Scribbo Arancio de Sicilio.
Here is Diatramentis Document Fuchsia. Here is Califolio Horidori.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see the tone is a bit lighter, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it barely spreads. It even has some moments to shade just a little bit, like if you summarize the entire thing, summarize kind of shows it, where most of it is a nice, very light, powdery baby blue, but the E at the end does get a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, the ghosting's not nearly as bad as you could expect on this type of paper, but it is there. I would say as a general rule, I would not write on the back of the page, but if this is the ink you're using a bunch of, you might get away with it here. None of this bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Pelikan M800's wet medium nib gives us a nice mid-tone of blue with good shading generally on most papers. Off camera, I went for a very dry stub, and the tone was only slightly lighter, not an issue, and it continued to shade very well. Now, this is such a consistent, boring ink that you can use it. I'm sure you heard that motorcycle going by with any pen, regardless of the wetness. So it could be a dealer's choice, but I really just liked it in the being a little more as far as the line width goes from a stub nib, where the flare really shows off the tone and the shading of this ink.